The contract was 3 pages long, printed on paper so crisp it could have sliced a finger if held wrong. I read every line twice in the parking garage of the recruitment agency before I signed it, the overhead fluorescent lights humming that particular frequency that sits just below a headache. The terms were clear. Compensation was generous. Duration, 6 months, with options to extend. Role, companion Omega for professional engagements, galas, investor dinners, industry summits. Behavior expectations, poised, presentable, discreet. What the contract did not prepare me for was Calvin Lambert himself. They had given me a file on him, 2 paragraphs, 42 years old. CEO of Lambert Industries, a firm that had its fingers in advanced materials, manufacturing, energy infrastructure, and a small but rapidly growing biotech subsidiary. Alpha designation, presented as secondary information rather than anything relevant, the way agencies always did now that designation laws protected against discrimination. Net worth listed in a range so wide it was almost meaningless, like describing a storm by saying it might rain a little or might level a city. The file included 1 photograph. It had been taken at some conference podium, probably cropped from a larger press image, the background blurred. Calvin Lambert stood at the microphone with the ease of someone who had long stopped being impressed by rooms full of people. He was broad through the shoulders, dark-haired going silver at the temples, in a way that looked less like age and more like weather. His expression was not quite a smile. It was something more complicated than that, the kind of look that could have meant confidence or could have meant he was already thinking about the next thing while the current thing was still happening around him. I told myself the photograph was not remarkable. I told myself that every time I looked at it in the 3 days between signing the contract and meeting him. My name is Terry Sparks. I was 29 years old when I took that job. Between things the way people get, between things when several plans collapse in close succession, a graduate fellowship that didn't renew, a sublease that ended, a relationship that had been struggling for 2 years and finally stopped struggling by stopping entirely. I was not desperate, but I was available, which is sometimes almost the same thing. The companion agency paid well. The work was intermittent enough to leave room for freelance writing work. I was still trying to make viable, and I had done similar contract work before without incident. I had never worked a long-term contract before. That was the difference I didn't fully appreciate when I signed. The first meeting was at his office building, 43rd floor, a corner suite with windows that turned the city below into something abstract and silver. I arrived 7 minutes early, sat in the waiting area on a chair that probably cost more than my rent, and practiced not fidgeting with the hem of my jacket. His assistant, a composed woman named Margaret, who moved with the efficiency of someone who had learned to anticipate everything, showed me in at exactly the scheduled time. Calvin Lambert was standing when I entered, not behind his desk, but beside the windows, looking out. He turned when the door opened, and the photograph had not prepared me for the scale of him in person. Not just height, though he had that too. Something more about how he occupied space. Like the room had quietly adjusted its geometry to center around him without asking anyone's permission. Mr. Sparks. His voice was even, unhurried. An alpha voice, the kind that didn't need to perform authority because it simply carried it. Sit down, please. Can Margaret bring you something? No, thank you. I sat. Kept my spine straight. Looked directly at him because looking away would have felt like losing something I hadn't agreed to forfeit. He sat across from me, not behind the desk but in one of the chairs arranged around a low table, closer than a desk would have placed him. I noticed he had the file the agency sent on me, a thin folder, closed on the table between us. He didn't open it. I've read your background, he said. The agency speaks well of you. I have some questions that won't be in the file. Of course. Why do you do this work? I had expected questions about event experience, about my knowledge of formal dining, about what languages I spoke, not that. Flexibility, I said. And I find the work less hollow than I expected to. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a reaction, more like a small registration. What did you expect it to be? Decorative. I expected it to be decorative, standing beside someone at events, looking appropriate, nodding at the right moments. I paused. It can be those things, but it's also often something else. People talk differently when they think someone nearby doesn't matter. You learn a lot, and that interests you. I'm a writer. Everything interests me. He looked at me for a moment that felt slightly longer than conversational rhythm required. The events I attend are not simple. Some of them have significant stakes, business negotiations, investor relations, situations where perception matters in ways that can affect outcomes that aren't trivial. He leaned back slightly. I need someone who understands that a dinner conversation is not just a dinner conversation, someone who can read a room, adapt, and not require management while doing it. I can do that. I know you can, he said. The question I'm trying to answer is whether we'll be able to work together comfortably. Have you had companions before who weren't comfortable to work with? The almost smile again. I've had companions who were professionally excellent and personally exhausting. I prefer competence without drama. I can offer that. What would make you uncomfortable about this arrangement? Not an accusation, just a direct question. He asked it the way someone asks who has learned that directness saves time. I considered lying, decided there was no point. If the professional boundary became unclear, if what was expected at events didn't match what was in the contract. It will always match the contract, he said. No hesitation, no reassurance for the sake of reassurance, just certainty. That's not a dynamic I have any interest in. Something in my shoulders released tension I hadn't consciously been holding. Good, I said. Good, he agreed. The first event was a charity gala for a children's medical foundation, held in a building whose lobby ceiling was entirely glass and entirely impractical and entirely beautiful. I wore a suit the agency had sourced, deep charcoal, well cut. Calvin met me in the car that picked us up, and there was a moment when I settled into the seat beside him and our eyes met and we both understood without saying anything that the professional shape of the evening was now beginning and we would both play our parts without needing a rehearsal. He was easier to be beside than I had anticipated. He didn't demand performance, didn't require me to laugh at things that weren't funny or sparkle at people who weren't interesting. When we moved through the room together, he introduced me simply. This is Terry, and let the ambiguity of my role be whatever each person assumed it to be. Beside an alpha of his stature, most people assumed companion, assumed claimed, assumed something personal, and Calvin neither confirmed nor corrected. He just moved with the ease of a man who had decided what he was doing and was simply doing it. I watched him work a room. It was something to watch. He didn't glad hand or perform warmth he didn't feel. He was direct, recalled details about the people he spoke to, asked questions that showed he had actually processed the answers to previous questions. He made people feel that his attention, when it landed on them, was worth something because he didn't scatter it carelessly. At one point, a man named Harwick, loud-suited, grip-first personality, cornered him near the bar and began talking about a development deal in a way that was clearly positioning. Calvin listened, gave nothing, smiled without revealing teeth, and extracted himself with the social grace of a magician making a card disappear. He materialized beside me 3 minutes later. Harwick's been trying to get into my supply chain for 2 years, he said, voice low. Not for anyone else, not performing, just telling me. He leads with his chin, I said. He told me about his boat before he told me his name. Something in Calvin's eyes shifted, something that was closer to actual amusement than the diplomatic expressions he'd been wearing all evening. He does that. He thinks it establishes something. It establishes that the boat is important to him and that he thinks it should be important to you. And is it his boat? Absolutely not. The almost smile became a real one, briefly, quickly recontained. But I had seen it, and something about having produced it settled warm in my chest in a way I noted and filed away under things to not examine too closely yet. The weeks that followed had their rhythm. A pattern assembled itself from the events the car rides before and after. the brief decompression conversations on the way home when both of us were no longer in our professional shapes, but not yet in whatever private selves we kept outside of work. Calvin was not forthcoming in those moments, but he was present, which felt like more than it sounds. He asked about my writing. He remembered things I had mentioned. When I talked about an essay I was working on, about the way urban architecture encloses and directs human movement like invisible choreography, he listened without looking at his phone. On a Friday night after a particularly long investor dinner, sitting in the back of the car with the city lights unreeling past the windows, he said, "You're quieter tonight?" The dinner was loud. It was. A pause. "Mettler's wife told you something that changed your expression for about 4 minutes." I turned to look at him. "You noticed that?" I noticed things I hadn't expected him to notice. I had kept my expression managed, I thought. "She told me her daughter had been asking about Omega rights legislation. She was worried the girl was getting involved in activist work. She said it in the way people say things when they expect agreement. And you didn't agree." "I'm an Omega," I said, quietly, without apology but without announcement either. Just as fact. "I think about legislation that affects me. Her daughter sounds more like someone paying attention than someone to be worried about." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. Calvin looked forward, not at me, for a moment. "Does it affect the work?" "Your designation. It affects how some people treat me when they find out. They recalibrate. They either become patronizing or proprietary, usually depending on their own designation and what assumptions they carry about Omegas in professional settings." "I don't need to recalibrate," he said. "I know." And I did know, which was the thing I hadn't expected. From the first meeting, he had dealt with me as a person who could perform a job competently, and that had not changed. "That's one of the reasons this contract has been easy." Another silence. Then, softer than his usual register, "Has this been easy?" It wasn't a professional question. It lived in the space between professional and something else, the space that had been slowly, incrementally growing between us from the moment that real smile had briefly crossed his face at the gala. "Easier than I expected," I said carefully. He nodded, looked back out the window, did not push, which somehow made it more. The first sign that things were more complicated than a clean professional arrangement came in the form of a man named Victor Crane. Victor Crane was Calvin's primary industry rival, a fact I had gathered from context over several weeks without it ever being explicitly stated. He ran Crane Advanced Solutions, which competed directly with Lambert Industries in the materials sector, and, from the careful silence that appeared in rooms when his name came up, and the particular quality of attention Calvin adopted when Crane was mentioned, I understood their relationship the way you understand fault lines, by what happens when they shift. Crane appeared at an industry summit dinner in early October, which I learned was unusual. Calvin's expression didn't change when his name appeared on the event seating, but his posture did. A small, controlled adjustment, the kind that means someone is managing something internally. Crane was handsome in an aggressive way, the kind of face that photographs well and in person makes you aware it knows it photographs well. He found us during the pre-dinner reception, which I suspected was not accidental. His gaze moved over me with an assessment speed that was so practiced it had become invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. "Lambert," he said, "I didn't know you were bringing a companion tonight." "Victor." Calvin's voice was pleasant and sealed as a vault. "Terry, this is Victor Crane. Victor, this is Terry Sparks." "A pleasure." Crane shook my hand and held it a beat too long, eyes on me. "You're not the usual type Lambert keeps around." "I wasn't aware there was a type," I said pleasantly. Something crossed Crane's face. Surprise, recalibrated quickly. "Direct. That's refreshing." He looked at Calvin. "Where did you find him?" "Terry and I worked together," Calvin said. Smooth, uninformative. "Do you?" It wasn't quite a question the way Crane said it. The dinner itself was uneventful, but Crane sat close enough that I felt his attention twice more, that practiced assessment quality, like he was cataloging information. Afterward, in the car, Calvin was quiet for longer than usual. "Crane made you uncomfortable," I said. Crane is always trying to determine something he doesn't know, Calvin said. Tonight he was trying to determine something about you. What would be worth determining about me? Calvin turned to look at me then, and the city light fell across his face in a way that made the silver at his temples look like intention rather than accident. Whether you matter, he said, to me. Whether you're something that could be used as information. Something turned over quietly in my chest. Do I matter? He held my gaze for a moment that stretched. That's a different question than what Crane was asking. He looked away. I breathed. The car moved through the dark and neither of us said anything else, but something had been placed between us in the air of that back seat, something without a name yet, but with weight. The rumor reached me through Margaret, of all people, who delivered it with the careful neutrality of someone passing on a live wire with rubber gloves. There's talk in certain circles, she told me, one morning when I had come to the office to coordinate logistics for an upcoming summit trip, that you and Mr. Lambert are presenting as bonded. I set down my coffee. Bonded, or, at minimum, claimed. She met my eyes. It's the way he introduces you. Just Terry. No qualifier. And the fact that you attend everything. Some people have made assumptions. I'm not bonded to anyone, I said. No. Her expression was carefully neutral. But perceptions in these circles have effects. Crane's people, specifically, have been asking questions about you. Background interest, they'd call it. After she left, I sat for a while with that information and tried to identify what I felt about it. The professional layer was clear. I had signed a contract. My role was defined. Any perception that exceeded that role was incidental, a byproduct of proximity. It didn't change the terms. But there was another layer, one I had been trying not to examine too directly, that responded to those words with something complicated and warm and inconvenient. Bonded. Claimed. As if someone asking whether I belonged to Calvin Lambert was a question I had private, unexamined feelings about. I did not address it with Calvin directly. That seemed like the wrong move for reasons I wasn't entirely willing to articulate even internally. I kept doing the work. I kept being professional. I kept noticing things I shouldn't notice, like the way his hand sometimes settled at the small of my back when we navigated crowds together. A guiding touch, nothing more. Except that it reliably produced a warmth that traveled up my spine and lodged between my shoulder blades. The Harwick situation accelerated things. Philip Harwick, of the boat introduction and the supply chain ambitions, organized a weekend industry retreat in early November. Calvin attended because the guest list included 3 people whose opinions could significantly affect a pending regulatory approval. I attended because that was the contract. The retreat was held at a lodge property 2 hours from the city. Rustic. In the expensive way, that means the wood is reclaimed and the bar is curated and the rusticness is itself a luxury performance. We arrived Friday afternoon, settled into rooms that were adjacent but separate because I had been clear about the contract terms when the logistics were arranged, and then gathered with 20 or so other industry figures for a dinner that functioned as very pleasant mutual intelligence gathering. Saturday was the problem. Harwick had arranged the day around activities, a morning session of what he called collaborative recreation, which turned out to be a competitive clay shooting event that I was entirely unprepared for, followed by lunch. Followed by informal discussions that were clearly the actual business of the retreat, but dressed as leisure. During the clay shooting, a man named Reed Albrecht, who I had identified over the past weeks as one of Crane's closer associates, positioned himself beside me while Calvin was occupied at a different station. Albrecht was a tall man with careful eyes, the kind of person who performs affability so consistently you can't see the seams. "You've been running with Lambert a while now," he said, watching the clay targets arc across the gray sky. "What's your read on him?" "My read?" I kept my voice neutral. "Relaxed. You're around him more than most people. What's he planning with the Meridian contract? Crane's been trying to get a meeting for months." There it was, underneath the social veneer which had been thinner than he probably thought. I'm not at liberty to discuss anything about Calvin's business plans. Albrecht's affability flickered, just briefly, Surely over 6 months some things come up. Not privileged information, just impressions. My impressions of Calvin Lambert are entirely personal, I said, and not yours to have. He smiled at that, but his eyes didn't join it. Territorial, he said. That's interesting. I just know the difference between a friendly conversation and an extraction attempt. Albrecht's smile stayed in place, but something shifted behind it. He drifted away a few minutes later with smooth social pretense, off to refill his drink. I breathed through my nose and watched the targets and felt my pulse settle. I told Calvin that evening. We were on the lodge's back terrace, the others inside, the cold air carrying pine and the distant hush of a river. I described the conversation, what Albrecht had asked, what I had said. Calvin was quiet for a moment after. You said your impressions of me were personal. It was the most efficient way to shut down the line of questioning. It implied a closeness that would make extraction seem both disloyal and pointless. And, was it true? His voice was still even, his eyes weren't. There was something in them that had moved from behind the vault door, something that was asking the question at a different frequency than the words themselves. Which part? That your impressions of me are personal. The cold air moved between us. The river was quiet enough to be a memory of itself. Yes, I said. The word came out quieter than I intended, more honest than was strictly professional. That part was true. He looked at me for a long moment. The professional shape of what we were was there between us, and underneath it something else was pressing upward, had been pressing upward for weeks, patient and unignorable. Terry. My name and his voice at that register, lower than his usual, careful with the consonants. I need you to understand something. Okay. What I'm about to say is outside the scope of the contract. If it makes you uncomfortable, I need you to tell me, and we'll continue exactly as before. My heart was doing something loud and inconvenient. Go ahead. I have not been thinking about you professionally for some time. He paused, looked away at the dark tree line, then back at me. For a man who spoke with perfect command in every other context, the pause was significant. I don't know how to account for that cleanly. I'm aware it complicates things. I'm telling you because not telling you felt like a worse complication. The cold air was very present against my face. My breath made a small cloud when it left me. How long? I asked. Longer than I should admit to. The almost smile, but softer than I had ever seen it, stripped of its professional packaging. The gala. You watched Harwick extract himself from his own pretension, and you told me he leads with his chin. I thought, then, that I was in some difficulty. I've been trying not to examine my impressions of you very closely, I admitted, for professional reasons. And if we set the professional reasons down for a moment? I looked at him. Calvin Lambert, who had never been anything other than exactly what he appeared to be, who had treated me with a consistency and respect that I had come to depend on without realizing I'd done so. Who had noticed that a woman's words changed my expression for 4 minutes at a dinner and remembered it 2 weeks later. Who made space for me in every room without making me feel like decoration. Then, I said slowly, I would say that I have been looking forward to car rides more than I can justify on professional grounds. And that when you put your hand on my back in crowds, I always know exactly which direction you're in without looking. And that your impressions of me are the ones I actually care about in every room we enter together. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something warm and quiet and enormous. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with 0 ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. Calvin reached out and touched my face, carefully, just his fingers at my jaw, a question in the gesture. I turned into it, just slightly. An answer. We stood like that in the cold air of the terrace for a moment that had its own particular weight and warmth. And then he lowered his hand, and we both breathed and looked at each other with the clear understanding that something had changed. The contract, he said. I know. I'd like to renegotiate it. I laughed, startled, brief and real. Renegotiate. The current terms no longer accurately reflect the situation. But he was almost smiling, the real smile, the one I had been collecting without meaning to since the first gala. I'm serious, Terry. I don't want to be your employer if there's something else that's more honest. What would the new terms be? He considered. Honest, mutual, without a termination clause. My chest did something enormous and quiet. That's ambitious. I've built several companies. I'm not afraid of ambitious terms. Calvin. His name in my mouth, without a title, without the professional register, just the shape of him. I think that would be acceptable. AER. We did not stay long on the terrace. The cold eventually drove us back inside, where we rejoined the gathering with the perfect professional composure we had both been maintaining for months, except that now it was layered over something else, something warm and named and shared between us. He was the same in the room. I was the same. And under it, like a frequency only we could hear, something had permanently rearranged itself. But nothing, of course, resolves cleanly when Victor Crane is in the orbit. The summit in December was the largest event of the contract period. 400 industry figures, 2 nights at a conference hotel that had commandeered an entire wing for the occasion, a program of panels and dinners, and the social maneuvers that were the actual architecture of the event underneath its stated agenda. Calvin had 3 meetings he needed to navigate carefully, 2 relationships to maintain, and 1 potential partnership to pursue with a materials firm whose CEO, a sharp woman named Dr. Asante, was reportedly selective about who she aligned with. Crane was there, as expected. Crane was always where Calvin was, had been for years, the professional shadow that never quite resolved into threat or neutrality. What was not expected was what Crane did on the first evening. He found me alone, briefly, between the reception and the dinner seating. Not Albrecht this time. Crane himself. He had the manner of a man who had decided to take a step he had been circling. "I'm going to speak plainly," he said. "Please do. Lambert is using you." His voice was even, matter-of-fact, as if this were simply information he was providing. You read as bonded to him in every room. People are starting to act accordingly. It's affecting how they position themselves relative to him, and he knows it. He's let it run because it's advantageous. I looked at him steadily. "Are you concerned about me, Mr. Pryfor, Crane, or about the fact that the perception protects him?" Something crossed his face. He hadn't expected that angle. Both can be true. You're here because people are being more cautious in their dealings with Calvin because they think he has a stable bond, and stable bonds suggest someone who has resolved certain personal variables and can be trusted with long-term partnership. I kept my voice pleasant. That protects him from people who would try to destabilize those relationships, including you. Crane's pleasantness remained precisely calibrated, but his eyes were very alert now. You're sharper than he advertised. He didn't advertise me at all. That's rather the point you're missing. I'm trying to tell you that he's using me. Yes. I met his eyes directly. But what you haven't asked, Mr. Crane, is whether I mind, or whether the situation is actually what you think it is. You've gathered information about me. You've had Albrecht fish for data, but you've been looking for leverage and not for the truth. And those searches tend to find what they're looking for rather than what's there. The silence between us stretched. Are you claiming the situation is different from what it appears? Crane asked carefully. I'm claiming that what's between Calvin and me is none of your concern, I said, and that it's not available to you as a tool or a vulnerability. Whatever you came here to accomplish with this conversation, it won't work. He studied me for a moment. The pleasant surface of him, that photogenic confidence, was still in place, but something behind it had been recalculated. He's lucky, Crane said finally, and it was the strangest thing because for a moment it didn't sound like rivalry. It sounded almost like acknowledgement. To have someone who speaks for him like that. I don't speak for him, I said. I speak for myself. We happen to be on the same side. Crane excused himself shortly after. I stood for a moment in the corridor, breathing slowly, and then went to find Calvin. I told him after dinner. When the evening had wound down enough for us to be in the hotel corridor outside our respective rooms with no professional performance required, Calvin listened to the whole account without interrupting, which was something I had learned to appreciate about him. He processed things whole rather than fragmenting them with premature responses. "You handled it correctly," he said. "I know. Not arrogance, just confidence. Are you going to tell me I should have come to find you instead?" "No." He looked at me with an expression that was open in a way his expressions at events never were. "I was going to say that you stood up for something that I haven't given you explicit reason to stand up for, and that matters to me." "You've given me reason," I said quietly. "The terrace, the car, 6 months of being treated like someone worth treating well." Terry. The same way he had said it on the terrace. The careful consonants, the lower register. "I know what I chose," I told him. "Crane was trying to tell me I was being used. What he doesn't understand is that I'm here because I want to be. That's different." He reached out, not the guiding hand at the small of my back this time, but his hand finding mine in the corridor, fingers curling around mine with intention rather than courtesy. "Come have a drink with me," he said, not as a business arrangement, as someone I would like to spend the next hour with because I want to. That sounds like renegotiated terms. "I'm working on the details." I laughed, and he held my hand and we went to find somewhere quiet in the large impersonal hotel, somewhere that could belong briefly to just us, and the corridor behind us was empty and the evening was ours. The weeks between December and January had a different texture than the months before them. The professional shape of things was still there. The events, the contract, the logistics coordinated by Margaret, who said nothing, but whose expression carried the particular knowing quality of someone who had expected exactly this development. But under the professional shape was something else now, acknowledged and warm, and being built carefully, the way you build things when you've decided they're worth building correctly. Calvin was different with me in private. Not unrecognizable, he was still precise and direct, and more comfortable with silence than most people. But there was a quality in the private moments that I came to understand as him allowing himself to be fully present without managing anything. He would ask about my writing not because it was polite, but because he was genuinely curious, would read things I sent him and return specific and considered thoughts. The kind of engagement that meant he had actually sat with the work. He told me things he didn't tell rooms full of people. The Lambert Industries that existed now was the third iteration of his vision. The first two had failed, one catastrophically, and he had rebuilt from those failures, with the particular knowledge you only get from having lost everything and discovered you were still standing. He was not sentimental about it. He described the failures with the same directness he brought to everything, as information that had been useful. "Were you afraid?" I asked once, during one of the conversations that happened in the particular quiet of his apartment, where I had begun to spend evenings that had nothing to do with events. Yes, no hesitation. The second company's collapse was the worst one. I had people who depended on it, people who lost things because of decisions I had made. He looked at his hands. Fear is the wrong word for what I felt about that. It was heavier. Guilt. Guilt. Guilt that I let compound into something useful eventually. He looked up. "I didn't run from the industry or from risk. I built more carefully." "The way you do everything," I said. Something in his expression softened. "You've noticed." "I notice things," I said, returning his own words from months ago. And the real smile appeared, unguarded, and did something to my chest that was becoming familiar and that I had stopped trying to manage. The Crane situation didn't end with the corridor conversation. In late January, a profile piece appeared in an industry publication. Someone, unnamed, had provided background on Calvin's recent activities, framed around a narrative about his management style and personal life. The personal life section was coded and careful, legal to print, but it implied things. It described his companion arrangement as an unusual choice for someone of his stature, and it quoted unnamed sources suggesting the arrangement served primarily to create a personal impression that didn't reflect reality. Calvin showed it to me without comment and watched my face as I read it. "Crane," I said, Probably, not certainly. This is intended to suggest the Bond impression is theater, that you're performing stability you don't have. Yes. The implication being that investors and partners should reconsider their assessment of you based on that instability. Yes. I set down the tablet, looked at him. What do you want to do? I want to hear what you think, he said, which was not the answer I'd expected. I think, I said slowly, that the piece has the problem of being almost correct. 6 months ago, we were a professional arrangement. The impression people had of us was incidental, not intentional on either side. Crane's information, if it's Crane's, was probably gathered early enough that it reflects that reality. And now? Now the impression and the reality are the same thing, I said, which the piece is wrong about, but correcting it requires saying things that are private. Calvin nodded. I won't issue any statement that requires you to be a character in a public narrative without your consent. It's not only my narrative, I said, it's yours too. Yes, he met my eyes. And what I want, privately and publicly, is for the reality to be clear, not for strategy, because it's the truth. Something in me that had been quietly uncertain for a while resolved into certainty. Not the cautious, contractual certainty I had arrived with months ago, something deeper, less qualified. Then let it be clear, I said. I'm not interested in performing something we're not. But I'm also not interested in pretending we're less than we are because someone with an agenda decided to write about us. He looked at me for a long, still moment. The vault door was not just open. It had been removed entirely. I love you, he said, quietly. Without preamble or performance, the way he said things that were simply true. Everything in the room was very still. I know, I said, and then, because that was only half an answer, I love you too. That part isn't new. He reached across the space between us and pulled me toward him, not urgently, but with a certainty that had no apology in it, and I went without hesitation. And we stayed like that for a long time in the apartment, with the city outside the windows, doing its indifferent silver and light thing. And it was the most at home I had been in, longer than I could clearly account for. There was a night in mid-January, between the December summit and the publication of that profile piece, when we stayed late at a gallery opening for a sculptor who was a distant acquaintance of Calvin's. The work was large-scale, polished steel forms that caught the gallery light and threw it back in distorted, beautiful sheets across the white walls. The reception crowd thinned early because of the cold outside, and eventually there were only a dozen of us left, moving slowly through the space, with glasses of wine and the particular quietness that settles when a crowd has become small enough to feel like company rather than audience. Calvin stood in front of one of the larger pieces, a curved column that somehow suggested both tension and release simultaneously, and was very still in a way I had come to associate with him, processing something privately. I came to stand beside him, not speaking, just present. After a while he said, "My mother was a sculptor, smaller work, clay mostly. I waited. She died when I was 19. Before any of this, a gesture that was minimal but encompassed everything around us. The gallery, the success it represented, the life that had come from the ruins of 2 failed companies rebuilt into something solid. I always think of her at things like this. Wonder what she would have said about the work. She had opinions. What kind of opinions? The corner of his mouth moved. Decisive ones. She didn't believe in hedging on whether something worked. Either it resolved or it didn't. Does this one resolve? He looked at the steel column for another moment. Yes, it knows what it's trying to do. I thought about what it cost him to say that casually, that small biography offered in a gallery after a long evening, the 19-year-old who had lost someone important and rebuilt himself anyway across the decades into this precise, careful, quietly enormous man beside me. Tell me more about her, I said. He did. Not expansively, not with the easy fluency of someone accustomed to discussing private things. Carefully, the way he did everything, in the specific details that mattered, her hands always chalked. The way she hummed when she was working and went silent when she was truly concentrated. The fact that she had never told him she was proud of him in those exact words, but had come to every presentation he had ever given in school and in later life, every public thing. As long as she was alive to come. We were the last ones in the gallery. The staff were beginning their quiet closing preparations, moving around us with the consideration people show when they can see something private is happening. Outside afterward, waiting for the car in the cold, I took his hand. Just that. He looked down at our joined hands and then at me, and something in his expression was the most unguarded it had ever been, the most allowed to be simply itself. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For asking." A pause. People who know my professional history don't usually ask about the parts before it. The parts before it are where you came from. Yes. He looked at me steadily. You're the first person in a very long time who has seemed interested in where I came from rather than where I am. I squeezed his hand and didn't answer because some things land better in silence, and the car arrived and we went home. And the evening folded itself into the accumulation of evenings that were building something between us that had started in a contract and was becoming something that no contract had ever been designed to hold. February brought the doctor, a Sunday dinner, and also, unexpectedly, a call from my brother. Marcus Sparks was 3 years older than me, lived 4 hours away, and occupied that particular sibling frequency of someone you love completely and rarely manage to see. He called on a Sunday afternoon when I was at Calvin's apartment reading, the comfortable domesticity of it probably audible in my voice when I picked up. "You sound settled," Marcus said. "What does settled sound like?" "Like you're somewhere specific rather than temporarily between somewhere else." A pause. "Are you at his place?" I had told Marcus the broad outlines. Not the contract, not the technical beginning of it, but the general shape of Calvin and what had developed. Marcus had listened without excessive reaction, which was one of the things I valued about him. "Yes," I said. "Is he there?" "In the other room." "Is it serious?" Marcus asked it the way he asked things, directly, without weaponizing the directness. "Yes, okay, a beat. Tell me about him, not the biography, what he's actually like." I thought about how to answer. From the other room, I could hear the particular quiet that meant Calvin was working, the small sounds of papers and the rare tap of a keyboard. The Sunday afternoon light was doing something gold and slow through the windows. "He notices things," I said. "Specific things about specific people, and he holds on to them." He remembered something I mentioned in passing 4 months ago and brought it up in the right context. I paused. "He's direct without being unkind. He doesn't perform warmth, but he has it. And he takes me seriously, which sounds like a low bar but turns out to matter more than I expected." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "And the designation thing? He's an alpha?" "He is. And he's never once made me feel like that's a dynamic between us, rather than just a fact about us." I looked at the doorway to the other room. "He doesn't think the designation hierarchy is something to perform or take advantage of. He thinks it's a piece of information about a person, one of many." The sound Marcus made when he was updating an assessment. "When do I meet him?" "When the time is right." "And when is that?" Calvin appeared in the doorway then, with the uncanny sense he had for when I might need something, holding a cup of tea he had clearly just made. He set it beside me without interrupting the call, met my eyes with a brief question in his, and I shook my head slightly to indicate nothing was wrong. And he returned to the other room with the straightforward consideration that was one of the things Marcus would have said something dry and accurate about if he had witnessed it. "Sooner than later," I said into the phone. Marcus met him 6 weeks after that over dinner at a restaurant halfway between our respective cities and said afterward in the car, with Marcus's uncanny ability to be simultaneously irreverent and precise, he watches you when you're talking and he's not thinking about what he's going to say next, he's actually listening. A pause. "That's rare." "I know." "Don't mess it up." "Thank you, Marcus. I mean it. He's good." "I know that too," I said. And outside the window, the highway was dark and starred with passing lights, and I was thinking about Calvin making tea in the apartment without being asked. and the way Marcus had spent the first 20 minutes of dinner asking Calvin about the second company failure, with the frank curiosity he applied to things he actually wanted to understand, and the way Calvin had answered him without performance directly, with the same honesty he brought to everything, and how Marcus had looked at me across the table afterward with an expression that said, "Yes, this one." The renegotiated terms, as Calvin had called them, took shape gradually and practically. Margaret was told, professionally, that the contract arrangement had evolved. She received this information with the air of someone who had been waiting for an overdue delivery. The agency was informed with the appropriate notice period, and the companion arrangement was formally concluded, replaced by nothing contractual, only something real. Dr. Asante, the materials firm's CEO Calvin had been pursuing a partnership with, had a dinner meeting with both of us in February. She was a small, formidably intelligent woman who said little during cocktails and then asked 6 questions during dinner that were each 3 questions deep. When she left, she had agreed in principle to terms that her lawyers would spend the next month formalizing. In the car afterward, Calvin said, "She approved of you. She approved of the deal. I had nothing to do with it," she said, and I quote, "that she trusts people who keep their own counsel but choose their companions well." A pause. "She meant it as a compliment to your judgment, and mine." I looked out the window at the city going by. Companion. "She didn't mean it the way the agency did." "No," I agreed. "I know what she meant." The word had a different weight now. Not a contract role, not a professional arrangement. Something older and realer. Someone who chooses to be beside you, not because the terms require it, but because that is simply where they want to be. Crane made one more move. In March, he arranged what appeared to be an accidental crossing of paths at a private club that both he and Calvin maintained memberships at. I was there, which I suspected was not what Crane had planned for but which he adapted to with the smoothness of long practice. Over drinks that lasted 45 uncomfortable minutes, he attempted to negotiate something vague, framed as mutual de-escalation, which translated as near as I could determine, to asking Calvin to stay out of a particular emerging market sector in exchange for Crane pulling back on the reputation work. Calvin listened to all of it with his characteristic vault door patience. Then he said, "Victor, I've never operated based on what you do or don't do. I don't intend to start." Crane glanced at me. "And him? He stays? Long-term?" Calvin looked at him with an expression I had come to understand as the face he showed people who had misunderstood something fundamental. "Terry doesn't stay because of my business. My business operates regardless." A pause. "But yes, long-term." There was a quality in Crane's response that was hard to categorize. He nodded once, looked at me with an expression that had shed some of its practiced quality, something more direct underneath. "You said we were on the same side," he said, recalling the December corridor. "What side is that?" "The side that's honest about what it wants," I said. A long pause. Crane drank, set down his glass. "Lambert," he said, "your companion is the most inconvenient person I've met in a decade." "I know," Calvin said, and the private warmth in his voice was probably not what Crane had expected to hear, but it was there, unhidden, and Crane heard it and said nothing more about it. The spring was bright and unhurried in the way springs are when you're not anxiously waiting for something. The essay I had been working on, the architecture one, found a home at a publication I had been trying to crack for 2 years. Small victory, clean and earned. I told Calvin over breakfast, the kind of breakfast that happens in his kitchen rather than a car or a hotel. And he looked up from the paper he had been reading and said, "Send me the final version," with the straightforward interest that had been one of the first things I'd cataloged about him back when I was still maintaining professional distance, and cataloging was all I allowed myself. "You've read every draft," I said. "I want the finished one. It's barely different from the last draft you read. Terry." The particular calibration of patience he applied when I was resisting something for no good reason. "Send me the finished one." "Fine." He returned to his paper. I watched him for a moment across the table, this particular Saturday morning light making the silver at his temples look like something rare, and felt the specific fullness of being in a life that had assembled itself from wreckage into something better than what I'd planned. I didn't expect this, I said. He looked up. The essay? Any of this? The contract? You! I gestured slightly at the kitchen, the breakfast, the ordinary, extraordinary fact of being here. I signed a 3-page document in a parking garage, and I thought I knew exactly what it was. What did you think it was? Work. Paid professional work with clean edges. And instead, I looked at him across the table. Calvin Lambert, who had been patient and direct and careful with me from the very first meeting, who had noticed everything worth noticing and never weaponized any of it, who had told me he loved me with the same plainness he brought to facts that simply were. Instead, I said, it was everything that came after. He looked at me with the full, unhidden warmth that still landed somewhere in my chest like it was new, even though it was familiar now, even though I had learned its shape. His hand found mine across the table, the same certainty as the December hotel corridor. Good, he said, and outside the city did its light and noise and motion indifferent as always. And inside, we were very specifically located in this kitchen in this morning, in this life that had negotiated itself into something the original contract never could have described. There was also the matter of my apartment. It had been a clean, functional space when I signed the companion contract, the kind of place that works fine for someone who doesn't plan to stay anywhere long. Over the months of the contract, I had been there less and less, not because anyone asked me to be elsewhere, but because the pull of Calvin's apartment, its particular quality of feeling inhabited by intention rather than convenience, had made my own place feel more temporary than it was. I raised it with Calvin in the spring, indirectly. My lease is up in 2 months, I said. We were in the car, late evening after an event, the city going silver and dark past the windows. Okay, he said, waiting. I've been thinking about whether to renew. Calvin had the rare gift of knowing when a pause was the right response. He let me be in the middle of saying something without filling the space prematurely. I've been spending most of my time somewhere else, I said carefully. You have, he agreed. And I like it, where I've been spending it. Good. Warm. Contained. What's the hesitation? I don't want to assume. He looked at me. Terry, you have been leaving things in my apartment since October. Books, a second phone charger, a specific brand of coffee I now buy because you prefer it. I have made no effort to return any of these items. Pause. I have also not asked you to take them back. That's a very Calvin Lambert way of expressing something. I'll express it directly if you prefer. Please. Don't renew the lease, he said, an invitation with his particular certainty in it. There's space, there's already your coffee. And I find the apartment better with you in it than without you. Something in my chest expanded and settled simultaneously. The books will multiply, I warned him. I have shelves. I write at odd hours. I'm a light sleeper. We've already established that this isn't a problem. Calvin. Yes? I would like to not renew the lease. He looked out the window. The corner of his mouth moved upward, the real smile he had stopped containing around me, still catching me every time, landing somewhere warm and permanent. Good, he said. Then it settled. The lease was not renewed. My books arrived in 17 boxes, which was apparently more than Calvin had anticipated, but which he received with the grace of someone who had said he had shelves and was committed to the consequence. We spent a Saturday afternoon arranging them, which became an argument that was actually a conversation about how to organize knowledge, alphabetical versus subject. He held the position of alphabetical with the composed certainty he brought to everything. I held subject-based organization with equal conviction. Alphabetical is more consistent, he said. Consistency isn't the point of bookshelves. Then what is? Finding things, which you do by subject, not by remembering every author's last name at the moment you want the book. He considered this fully, the way he did everything. Both systems have merit. By subject, I said, we'll do 2 sections, 1 each, which is what we did, and the books took up more wall space than either of us had mapped out, and the apartment looked more lived in than it ever had. And neither of us said anything about that, but both of us noticed. I had stopped being between things. I was somewhere specific, and it was chosen, and it was real. Months later, at a gala that was in some ways like the first gala, and in all the important ways nothing like it, Philip Harwick found me at the bar. He had gotten the new boat, larger than the last one, about which he informed me within approximately 90 seconds. He had also, apparently, heard various things about my relationship with Calvin, because he regarded me now with a recalibrated assessment that was slightly different from the original. "You've done well for yourself," he said, which was a graceless way to put it but was not unkind. "I've done honestly for myself," I said, which turned out to be the same thing. He blinked. "Absorbed this. He's good to you?" "Yes." "And you to him?" I looked across the room to where Calvin was in conversation with two people whose body language told me the conversation was going the way he wanted it to go. As if he felt the direction of my attention, he glanced across the distance between us, just briefly, with the specific quality of attention he reserved for when I was in his field of awareness. No performance in it. Just presence. "Yes," I said. Harwick unexpectedly smiled. A genuine one, which I hadn't seen from him before. "Good," he said. "The man needs someone who holds their own." He moved away to find his next conversation, and I finished my drink, and then I crossed the room to where Calvin was standing. And when I reached him, his hand found the small of my back the same way it always had, guiding and certain. And I let myself be guided because I wanted to be, which was different from being decorative, which was different from being managed, which was different from every version of this that had come before. "Harwick's boat is bigger," I said, low, "for only him." The real smile. Quick, contained, entirely real. "Of course it is." He asked if you were good to me. Calvin turned slightly, enough to see my face. "What did you say?" I said yes. I met his eyes. It seemed accurate. His expression did the thing it did when something I said landed in the particular way he hadn't expected but wanted. Warm, open, the vault door not just open but unnecessary now, a piece of architecture that belonged to a different configuration. "Accurate," he said. "Very." We stood together at the center of the room, the event moving around us with its usual designed energy, and I was who I was, and he was who he was, and we were simply present and real and chosen, and no contract in the world needed 3 pages to say that. What they wrote about us, eventually, in the industry journals and the social columns and the occasional profile, was never quite the truth, because the truth was too simple for those formats. They wanted the narrative of the companion who became something more, the transactional beginning with its romantic development, the rival who tried to use it and failed. They wanted edges and drama. The truth was quieter than that. The truth was that I arrived for a job and met someone who saw me clearly from the first conversation, and that clarity was the thing I had not known I needed until I had it. The truth was that Calvin Lambert, who had built companies from failure and navigated rooms full of calculated people with perfect composure, was capable of enormous private warmth when he trusted someone with it. The truth was that I had stopped running from the life I actually wanted long before I realized I was running. The truth was that the contract had 3 pages and the rest of it was unwritten and ours. Victor Crane, last I heard, had entered a new sector that had nothing to do with Calvin's firm, which may or may not have been coincidence. Harwick got another boat. Margaret remained the most efficient person I had ever encountered and received on the occasion of her work anniversary. A card signed by both of us that she placed on her desk with the careful placement of something she intended to keep. And Calvin, at breakfast on a morning in autumn, slid something across the table toward me. A folded piece of paper, which was unusual for him, a man of digital precision and minimal paper. I unfolded it. 3 pages, printed on crisp paper. The terms were new. The compensation section had been replaced. The duration section read, "Indefinitely, without clause." The role section read, in Calvin Lambert's precise, unhurried handwriting, beneath the typed text, "Whatever you want it to be." I looked up at him. "Renegotiated terms," he said. "As discussed." This took you 7 months. I wanted to get them right. I looked back down at the 3 pages, the same number as the document I had signed in a parking garage under fluorescent lights. Between things, available, not quite knowing what I was signing toward. The paper just as crisp. The terms, unrecognizable from those first ones, better in every way that mattered. The termination clause, I said. There isn't one, I noticed. Is that acceptable? I folded the pages back along their creases, looked at him across the breakfast table, in the autumn morning light, in the life we had been building since before either of us had named it. More than acceptable, I said. He held my gaze for a moment that was exactly as long as it needed to be. And then he returned to his coffee and I returned to mine. And outside the city continued its enormous, indifferent motion, and we were inside it specific and located and entirely precisely where we had chosen to be. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.